Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to present some of my thoughts. I only wish I could be with you in Budapest. I'm going to talk about what I see as, at least in a preliminary sense, what the impacts of the pandemic could be. And I'm going to have a slideshow here, so I'm going to segue now to share my screen and put up my slides, and then begin the talk. Do this again. Okay. So obviously the pandemic is one of these earth-shattering events that we seem to have more of in the last decade or so. You think about 9/11, if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, these are they're certainly surprises and shocks to a lot of people. There were people that saw them coming. We knew that we were overdue for a pandemic, but nevertheless, the fact that it happens, surprises governments, societies. It does have a sort of turning the page effect. And with the pandemic, this is a rolling crisis. We really don't know the end point. It could stretch into 2024 for some parts of the world. We don't know too what's going to happen to the variants if we have another Delta variant, a very virulent strain that again begins to affect not just those that have been vaccinated or gotten boosters, but the whole world. So this is, as I say, a preliminary view. In my mind, the two big impacts are on equality and on globalization. And obviously we have seen inequality and we have seen deglobalization gather steam before the pandemic. But the pandemic is giving a push to those, and in a way that I don't think we appreciate at this point. So getting the slides show here, looking at the pandemic's effect and beginning with the advanced economies, China, which are actually have done in some ways surprisingly well, given where some of the pessimistic forecasts were a year or so ago. But there is differentiation between China, the US, and other European countries. And obviously, in the case of the relative losers, those that are having a hard time making up for the lost economic growth, that's going to continue, and those lost opportunities are going to figure into the world in 2-3 years' time. We saw that after the 2008 financial crisis. How quickly the recovery gathers steam is very important to how people feel, whether feel that they've lost, appreciably, and there's, as we'll see, greater inequality, or, and this is particularly true for younger generations, getting going in their careers, or whether we manage to make up for lost ground quickly, and we don't have the effects we had after 2008, the growth of populism in Western countries, extremism, radicalism, and loss of faith in democracy. The ones that are the real losers, I think, are in the developing world. And this is a real sadness that you've seen for the first time in several decades, the middle class there begin to shrink. And obviously that was one of the great achievements of globalization since the 1990s, of lifting millions out of poverty. Some, in the case of China, there's relatively few people who have sunk back into poverty, but you're seeing with India, South Asia, and I think these figures on sub-Saharan Africa are probably understating the problem there, particularly as these were compiled a year ago, and we've seen basically continuing spread in sub-Saharan Africa, and as we'll see in a slide, very little help in terms of vaccines. So this slide shows basically you have a select few who have the vaccines, and you have Africa, where you have a fairly large proportion of the world's population really don't have that access. Concerning thing is that as we get more interested in the US, Western Europe, and other places in booster shots, we're more likely to hold back on providing the surplus vaccines that we have to COVAX so that they can distribute to the developing world. So in a sense, as the slide shows, that the variant Delta is bad news in several ways for those countries who don't have vaccines. It means probably a longer wait, and then they're also vulnerable to the spread of variants. As I indicated, one of the big negatives with this crisis, and coming so soon after the 2008 crisis, is the fact that younger generations are hit again. And we're seeing this with the unemployment rate in OECD countries, even though in the light blue is the unemployment rate in June 2021. So in a sense, this is after a recovery has started. It is really in the dark blue is before the pandemic. So it hasn't, the unemployment hasn't been reduced yet. We're also seeing this obviously with ethnic, racial minorities, particularly hard hit. They were the most at risk at getting the vaccine, because many of them continued to work. They were in service jobs, essential service jobs, so they were more likely to get it in their workplace, like grocery stores, medical facilities, and other places. And they basically have and many of them lost their jobs. So basically those who were very just on the edge of prosperity before the pandemic are the ones that have been pushed down and really losing their footing going forward. And this is a study that the Cambridge Center for the Future of Democracy did, looking at which groups are losing their faith in democracy. So the fact that you have them younger people losing out again economically, And we know that, it's very hard for them to recoup those lost years when they could making progress in their career, and that translates into becoming increasingly dissatisfied with democracy. This is actually a worldwide trend, so very concerning for us who still have faith in democracy. Final slide looking at the US, and obviously this is a trend that started before the pandemic. You haven't had, unlike with the EU, you haven't had the US engage in negotiating big regional trade agreements after with the 2016 election. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have walked back from any ideas of a Trans-Pacific Partnership arrangement or another one with Europe, TTIP. And so the US is becoming a lot more closed. Say one of the effects we're seeing with the pandemic itself is increasing hostility towards China. The public opinion polls show that the public is really, over the course of a couple of years, becoming very hostile towards China. You find a lot of blame for the pandemic is put on China, to an extent, rightly so, but nevertheless, that is translating into a feeling first that we may want to decouple. You have an elite who's talking about, particularly on the technology side, they've gone after Huawei, but thinking of trying to keep Chinese technological development at a down, and keeping U.S. leadership on tech still being leaders in the world. So one way is to keep the Chinese down. You have other beliefs that China has also stolen jobs, and that's one of the factors behind this reluctance to really open up. And you're seeing this also with immigration, where land of immigrants, a lot more concern, and for particularly one, the conservative part of the political spectrum, but it's actually on both sides, and the opinion polls believe that the US is taking in too many people. So, US was one of the drivers of globalization in the 1990s. This turnback, which Biden has reversed a lot of what Trump did, gotten back into the Paris Climate Agreement, but on this issue on trade has yet to really figure out if he wants to go back to the Obama era efforts to develop regional trade agreements. More likely, because it is so politically toxic, they will be content with smaller sort of agreements. And that, I think, means that, one less champion for globalization, and particularly US, not being a champion, that you're likely to get an additional push to deglobalization. So with that, why you do strategic foresight and looking at these trends now is the hope that we can reshape them. Belief particularly that we need to vaccinate the world. That comes up in all these slides looking at the developing world and the fact that it's losing ground. You have this loss of the global middle class, which will be very hard for it to make up for over the next decade. that we need to figure out how to get the vaccines out, how to help them with their economic recovery programs, and we need to, in the U.S. and elsewhere, particularly, we need to think about opening up to the rest of the world on trade, finding a way, I think, both Europeans and the U.S. to deal with immigration in a fair and honest way. This isn't going away. So these are trends we can reshape if we want, or we can sit back and just allow them to get worse, or at least in my mind, that would be the end result. I'm happy to take questions if you want, or we can.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Burrows. Thank you for your presentation. There is no question and answer part, so I would just like to thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.